Hello everyone, and welcome to this video about cyber risk and about understanding the dangers you face from cyber attackers. And this is a video taken from a series of materials I produced for one of my customers, and I thought I might as well share it on YouTube because it's kind of free information. It's something that people should all understand. And hopefully it's something you'll find quite interesting as cyber attacks become more of a front page situation. So in terms of cyber risk, and we're talking here about the risk to IT infrastructure and data from people who attack it generally electronically, often remotely, and sometimes for reasons that are or are not obvious. And it's quite obvious to say this: cyber attacks are on the rise and the outcomes are getting more serious. And I was going to put in a statistic here, but I don't find that statistics motivate people very much, because saying they're a 600% rise or costing companies an average of X amount of money, I don't think motivates people, because a lot of us are still in denial that we're really a target, that anything's going to happen to us. So I've avoided putting in the statistics, but most of us will be aware of ransomware attacks that affected lots of infrastructure in the UK particularly. We had lots of health authorities having systems get encrypted by malware and having to pay ransoms or losing the data. We've all seen some of the big breaches that happen at large organisations, and some of those cost tens of millions of pounds to put right. But we need to understand our risk, because if we make a decision and we don't really understand what we're doing, then we're risking spending too much money. And at the end of the day, most of us watching this video are business owners or business decision makers, and we need the business to do well. We can't be spending ridiculous money on things we don't understand. One story I heard about was a company who spent $2 million on a security product. They didn't really think about it too much. It theoretically solved their problem, but they weren't able to maintain it properly, and after 6 months they switched it off. So £2 million is a lot of money to spend on something that we don't fully understand. So that's part of what's going on here. Now, the traditional route for any business to understand cyber risk was to perform risk assessments. So you measure what data you're holding, the value of the data, who has access to it, what systems you have, what's connected to what's on the internet, what isn't on the internet, etc., etc. And then you would assess the risk of each of those pieces of infrastructure or data in terms of the value to your company if it was private data, the value to your reputation if it was somebody else's data, or the value to your lost business if it was a piece of infrastructure that got taken out of use by an attacker. It's quite long-winded, it's quite big, it's quite expensive generally, especially if you need to pay somebody to come in and do it for you. So for small businesses, not really very helpful. The other way of looking at it is you can simply implement a load of controls and say, well, I'm not going to bother doing the risk assessment. I'm just going to do some good idea stuff and hope for the best. Now, that's not a terrible idea as long as that's guided by, some kind of framework, which we'll actually look at the end of this video. But again, we can't simply blindly introduce things without understanding a bit more about the risks. Otherwise, we risk paying for things we don't need, and we don't implement things that we do. Now, the way I'm going to approach this instead in this video is I'm going to say, well, we can understand the landscape a bit better if we understand who the attackers are. And if we understand who the attackers are, we should be able to more easily consider what it is they're after in our organization, and therefore the most important security controls that we need to implement to make our business run and to keep the attackers out. So the next series of slides really are about these attackers. I've grouped them into various categories. Obviously, these categories are fairly broad, but they probably represent most types of attacker and what it is they're actually looking to do. And you'll see this in lots of security videos, the kind of pyramid. And here this pyramid really describes how often these attacks occur. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we have the kind of least intentional, least motivated, least targeted, and least resourced attackers. We call them script kiddies, people just kind of mucking around and doing whatever they feel like doing. And you will find those very, very often. You put any system onto the internet, you'll probably find ports being scanned and all kinds of things happening very, very quickly, even before you've even done anything. So these are completely untargeted. They might be genuine research, albeit done without permission. And in some cases, they might be semi-targeted, but in general, they're not very targeted, but they happen all the time. And then as you move up the pyramid, a lone hacker is somebody who's maybe a little bit more motivated. They're doing something deliberately. They're not just mucking around. Maybe their motivation, their targeting is still not very high, but they might be kind of just seeing what they can do. Then an activist, you're kind of getting to slightly more targeted territory now. Again, less frequent depending on who you are as an organization. And one thing we'll see a lot through these slides is it depends. It depends who you are. If you are a political organization, then clearly you are going to be targeted by activists more frequently than if you are not a political organization. So hopefully most of that will kind of make sense to you already. And then we start kind of heading into crime territory. So we have people, they might be small organizations. They might even be selling, freeware or payware hacking tools. So we're kind of getting into crime territory. So now we're talking about less frequent attacks, but better resourced, generally more targeted, but not necessarily. And then as we kind of get towards the top, organized crime is, people with deep pockets. They've made a lot of money. It might be to do with drug running or human trafficking or arms trafficking. And maybe these kind of attacks are more likely to be against people like crime organizations and the like, just to actually either, pollute the evidence, to break the evidence, or just to kind of get intelligence for their other activities. But also, like the freelance crime, these could be guns for hire. They could be hired to target a particular organization. And then at the top of the pyramid, probably the least frequent, obviously we wouldn't really know, and the most targeted generally are attacks from a nation state. Of course, it could be your own nation state, it could be another one, but this is really kind of saying, look, the ones you're going to get a lot are down the bottom, but as you might expect in terms of the outcomes, generally the outcomes are more serious the higher up you go. So there's this kind of seesaw effect. Do I kind of really target the frequent ones that are easy to fix, that are not really that serious? Or do I spend more money, more time concentrating on the more significant attacks, which cost more money to protect against, but then are going to provide more benefits? So somewhere in here is a kind of line at which your organization should decide that's really your risk level. Now, the opposite of that pyramid, of course, is the amount of resources that these people have. So clearly a nation state is always going to be very wealthy. They're going to have more resources generally than pretty much every organization in the world, apart from maybe a handful of very large companies mostly in the US. Organised crime, again, are going to have a lot of resources. The amount of time they're going to spend on these things can be significant. A nation state or an organised crime syndicate could be playing the long game. They could put some malware in a system that sits there for months and months and months, waiting for an appropriate point either to activate or waiting until a certain other condition is met that allows the malware to do its work. So some of these things take a long time. Clearly the script kiddies, the guys who are just trying stuff out and goofing around, they're not going to spend a lot of time or money on doing stuff. They're going to see if they can find low-hanging fruit. They're going to just play around, and then they're going to be moving on to somewhere else. So what I want to do now is look through each of these in turn and kind of give you a rough idea as to what it is that they want, what are they being motivated by, and then for each of them a grid which describes how frequently these attacks against your business, your infrastructure are likely to happen, how targeted these attacks are, and that will be relevant to some organizations more than others. Then the level of outcome, how much damage are these people going to do if they succeed? And then how easy is it to protect against these people in terms of the kind of level of money you're going to have to spend to get in protection for your equipment and for your software. So the first of these, so starting at the bottom of the pyramid, is the Script Kiddie. So we call them a Script Kiddie. We think of a kind of the equivalent of a bored teenager. I'm doing this just because I can. I might have a motivation, I might not have any. I might be doing this because I have no motivation and I get some sense of power or identity. Even if I don't have anyone to boast to, I might still kind of make myself feel better because I've managed to hack a system or find an open port or, find a database that should be protected or whatever. So we're talking about things that are so easy to do. Now, the tooling to do this is all available for free, to do various attacks, to automate them. Almost all of it is free. There are some paid for products, but there's generally a free version or a free equivalent of every paid piece of software. So dead easy to do. There are thousands of people around the world who have the skills and the inclination to do this. And obviously, millions of computers. So not hard to do at all. It's a Script Kiddie. They're generally not targeting people because unless they have a reason to target somebody which would make them an activist or whatever, then there's no real targeting. The outcome in general, they're not necessarily looking for anything, so they're not, even if they manage to get a data dump, would they do anything with it? Maybe not. So the outcomes are generally low, but the good news is protecting against these level of attacks is fairly easy, and we'll talk about that at the end. Now, the lone hacker is kind of, there's no particular line between, say, a lone hacker and a Script Kiddie, but at this kind of level, we're talking about somebody who has some kind of motivation to do this. So it might be like a burglar, which is the example I've used here, is I don't necessarily know when I break into a house what I'm going to find in there, but depending on what I find will dictate what I do with that. So if I find some jewellery, I might go and sell it at the pawn shop. If I find some cash, I'll put it in my pocket. So I might not necessarily know what's going on. And in general, I'm, again, probably still not targeting people particularly. I might be, again, it depends on the motivation. Am I just somebody who's got a bit of an axe to grind against financial organisations or against the media or governments or whatever? So I might be targeting, but in general, I'm not really targeting that much. And depending on what I find will dictate what I do with it. So the outcomes, of course, could be fairly severe because if that person does find a load of data and decides to publish it on the web for everyone to see, that could be a hit on your reputation and potentially financially if you get fined by a regulator, that kind of thing. So there is some potential outcomes to consider, but again, the protection here, because the motivation is quite low, the protection is generally fairly straightforward. Which then moves us to activists. So the significance here is that an activist tends to, but not always, target the people that they want to attack because they're trying to make a political statement. Now, that's not always the case because, of course, if somebody finds an unprotected website of something completely random, they might still hack that site to put up an advert saying whatever it is they want to say politically. I say political in inverted commas because it's not necessarily officially political or party political. It might be, a gripe against gun control or something to do with, fathers for justice or whatever it might be. So people can hack a site that's not political in itself just because it's easy to do. But in general, an activist will try and damage the site of an organisation they disagree with. And so therefore it's generally quite a high targeted attack. Frequency, it kind of hit and miss really, and again this depends very much on your organisation. If you are some kind of organisation that has a political angle, even if you're somebody like Google who might do something that has a political overtone to it that people don't like, just because they're a big organisation, they're going to create big headlines. People are going to say, I dislike that about Google, so they might try and attack something related to Google to kind of get their own back. The outcomes, again, if it's a targeted attack, could be reasonable because they're looking to damage you potentially. If it's purely a defacement of a website to put up a political banner, then might not be any significant fallout for your organization, except that you would need to repair and hopefully add some protections. And again, protection depends on whether you're targeted or not. If you're a target for this type of attack, then the people might be quite persistent and might be reasonably well funded. So the protection might take that little bit of extra effort. If you're not a direct target, then your normal protections you'd put in for the other categories would protect against this too. So now we get to the kind of crime areas. And of course, things are kind of getting more serious now because there's usually a motivation for crime. People don't do crime just because they feel like it. Mostly they do it because they want something. And in the case of electronic crime, e-crime if you like, generally there's a financial motivation at some level. It might be directly to the person doing the attack, or it might be a financial benefit to somebody who has paid the attacker to perform the attack on their behalf. So frequency will depend on your organization again. If you're a company that has high value kind of assets in some way, we'll discuss that a bit later, then you might be attacked quite frequently and people might be trying lots of different things to get a way in. And the targeting, generally fairly targeted, because if you're just some kind of random company, the chance of somebody making any decent money from what they find compared to the amount of time it's going to take them to find a vulnerability is probably not really going to make it worth it. But of course, the outcome here, because we're talking about crime, the outcome could be significant, because if somebody's trying to steal your intellectual property or your customer lists or whatever, this could cost you a lot of money. It could cost you a lot of reputation, fairly significant. And understandably, the protections against these higher levels start to get more difficult and involve more than just let's throw a few security controls in here and hope for the best. Generally, to protect against these higher levels of crime, we have to be more deliberate. We have to consider our risks a bit more carefully than we would otherwise. It's doable. It's not impossible, but you've got to be a bit more careful. And I've likened these guys to being kind of a mercenary, because in terms of the kind of freelance criminal, they're generally doing it for hire, but they might be the organization themselves. And then then organized crime really is the next level up from that. So this is kind of the armed robber. So these guys have got more money, they've got more motivation. Now, if you're a bigger crime organization, you're not going to waste your time on doing something that's going to get you a payment of a couple of $100, whereas the lone kind of criminal might well do that. These guys are in it for big money, so the outcomes here are very high for your organization. If these guys are bothered to hack into your company, then they want something probably very targeted, fortunately quite a low frequency, but because the outcomes are so high, if you're susceptible to this kind of targeted attack, then you do need to take these things seriously. And again, unsurprisingly, the protection levels now are starting to get much higher. The top level really is the nation state, a government, if you like. So at least theoretically, their motivation is either strategic, so maybe they're trying to find out what another nation is doing, and maybe it's to do with national security. Maybe I'm worried about a particular organization and what they're up to that's going to affect my country, so I'm going to put some malware into their company to see if I can find out what's going on. The frequency, of course, is going to be very low, so these tend to be, very deep penetration, very super targeted, so the targeting is generally very, very specific. And the outcome, certainly in the worst case, would be very high for your organization. But of course, being very secretive and being a nation state in some cases, the outcome could be zero, because if they're just spying on you and not actually affecting your business outcomes, then there's a chance that you would never know they had ever been there, and they might not be out to bankrupt you or to cause you any kind of business inconvenience. So it will depend a little bit, but certainly in the worst case, if a nation state attacks you, then you're in trouble. And of course, to protect against these sort of levels, for most companies, we'd consider it, not doable. It is doable, But of course, these guys have got the money to pay somebody to get a job at your company and attack it from the inside. They've got the money to potentially sabotage your supply chain and replace one of your bits of IT equipment with a different one. So in many ways, we could kind of consider these unprotectable, but if we were really that motivated, we could put in a number of things that probably would protect us as much as we ever would. So the question is then, well, am I at risk? You're watching the video are from wherever, you're an estate agent or a solicitors or a tech company or whatever you are. Am I at risk? And of course the answer is yes, but, and this is where, we go back to that idea of where do I draw the line in that pyramid? Clearly, it depends on your business. So all of the businesses are different, and the value that we offer to any of these different levels of attacker is going to be different. If I'm a 4-person solicitors company, am I likely to get attacked by a nation state? Probably not, or almost certainly not. Am I likely to be attacked by organised crime? Again, it would be unlikely, possible but unlikely. So your kind of risk appetite could be lower than somebody like, say, a government site or a online electoral roll information that might have names and addresses and personal details, or a medical database and stuff like that. So it does depend. Everyone is going to experience high volume, low outcome attacks. Now, I say everyone, and I mean everyone, because like I said earlier, you put any system on the internet, it will immediately, sometimes within seconds, start experiencing people effectively probing for open ports on it. And people do this sometimes in demonstrations. They get a computer, they turn off the antivirus on it, they plug it in for an hour, then they run the antivirus and find about 50 viruses on there, especially older operating systems. So we're all going to have this. That's a given. But of course, the question is, if you have the high value assets, you're going to become more of a target. And that's a business decision for you. Do you think that you're more of a target because of the sort of thing you do? And you'll have to answer that question yourselves. Is it a fight worth fighting? With a nation state, if they're going to attack you, like I say, they've probably got the means to do it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't necessarily try or at least consider it, because we could at least potentially make their job more difficult. We could put in kind of attack detection, which might give us a kind of a heads up on things happening. But for most of us, it's probably not a fight worth fighting for the money. So then the kind of practical question, which, I just want to kind of finish with really, is how do we protect ourselves? We kind of understand our attackers. We can go through that list and say, right, these are the sorts of people I think would attack my site, and this is what they're trying to do. How do we protect it? Well, a really good starting place, very practical, very simple, is the National Cybersecurity Centre. That's the UK National Cybersecurity Centre. They have a Cyber Essentials program. You can get certified by somebody who's authorised to certify people, or you can actually go through the guidance yourself if you're suitably technically inclined. It's not particularly difficult. And effectively what they've done is said, well, we've already done the risk assessments for you. You are at risk of malware. You are at risk of, of people taking advantage of vulnerabilities in unpatched systems and non-updated mobile devices, all the rest of it. So let's just give you the controls to say this will help you probably cover 80-90% of the attacks that you would ever face. Because remember, some of these are accidental, untargeted. It might just be somebody sending out a phishing email, hoping for somebody to bite. So the Cyber Essentials control is a really good way, very good value for money. So the current price, £300 plus VAT, and you can have the basic audit done. And then a lot of the organisations that run these, including ourselves, will also offer kind of value-added services if you want additional scans and stuff to verify that that what you're saying is true. Do you want some kind of insurance-backed guarantee and all those sorts of things? Then you can get that. Don't underestimate how fast and basic training can go. So this could be different for, say, IT staff and development staff and everyone else. But just an hour or two of some basic ideas of what these things look like, what they mean, how we can just be cautious about stuff. That could go miles and miles. It only takes one person to do something wrong, and it can, cause a massive effect on your company. So just think the kind of investment of, again, a few £100s on some training, and maybe, just maybe, that will avoid the, tens of thousands it might cost you to get in a proper serious kind of disaster recovery company to try and fix everything after it's been broken. Secure coding processes. If you develop your own software, it's important that you build that into your life cycle, your software development life cycle, so that you can ask the right questions at the right point in time. And that's something is quite a big topic, but something that we can help you with. Setting up a firewall and just general good network practice. So segregated networks so that everything doesn't have visibility of everything else. You're having virtual subnets so that, scanners and malware can only see what they would, what your computer should be able to see, and not necessarily all of the servers, infrastructure and everything else. So just kind of good network stuff. Firewalling things is probably one of the easiest and quickest, and in most cases free way of protecting network servers and protecting your company network from the public internet. Automatic updates as well. There's always a danger that getting the latest update is going to have a vulnerability in it, but you're more likely to have a vulnerability if you don't update things than you are if you have automatic updates turned on. So that's operating systems, that's apps, that's any pieces of software that you have. And if you don't have the ability to automatically update stuff, then you should somehow put into your day-to-day business a way of monitoring how often should I check for updates, how often should I patch things. Cyber insurance is worth considering. Now, you've got to be a bit careful. You've got to ask the right questions, because you've got to make sure it covers everything that you will need to cover. And there's a good chance that you probably don't even know how much it would cost you if you did have a disaster. But a good way of kind of answering that question is, what would happen if somebody came into your office today, took every single thing out of your office, all the PCs, all of the networking equipment and everything else. If they took all of that and you never got it back, how much would it cost you to actually put that right? So you talk about equipment replacement, but you're still about, well, how do I get the data back? How do I recover from the disaster? How can I cover any potential kind of fines and things like that I might get from a regulator? In the States, for instance, you have to do certain things by law if data gets breached. How much does that cost? If I've got 1 million users, how much is that going to cost me to contact all of those 1 million users? So all of those kind of things are worth considering from a kind of disaster recovery point of view. Because at the end of the day, if you don't understand the problem, then you're only going to make poor decisions. They might cost you money and end up not helping you. Or they might cost you too much money. They might protect you, but cost you 10 times as much as it should have. And on the other hand, you might end up spending money on things that, or not spending any money on anything, and being completely vulnerable to some of these kind of cyber attackers. So hopefully I've given you a fairly good overview of the kind of people that you should be considering when you're actually considering your kind of threat analysis for your organization.